Professor Mickey. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Montesquieu Forum. The Montesquieu Forum began with a generous donation from the Jack Miller Center, to whom we were and continue to be thankful, and this lecture in particular is owed to a very generous donation provided by a member of the Roosevelt University class of 1949, Art Weil. And I'm certain that if he were here, he'd be exceedingly pleased, not only because we're talking about Plato's Republic today, but in particular because of our guest speaker today, Professor Ronna Berger. She is a professor of philosophy and chair of the philosophy department at Tulane University. She's also the Seisler Professor of Jewish Philosophy at Tulane University. I've had the distinct pleasure of knowing Professor Berger for 17 years, and I was thinking about it this morning on the way into school, and I'm certain we've had no fewer than 2,000 conversations with each other over those 17 years. She is the best philosopher I know, truly. She lives more than anyone else I know a philosophical life. Everything to her, every conversation, however ordinary it might seem at the beginning, always turns into something deep. Therefore, it's a great honor and indeed a privilege to have Professor Berger with us here. She was the first lecturer of the Montesquieu Forum, talking about Moses and the law. Today, she's going to be speaking to us about a funnier subject, but as serious a subject: laughter, anger, and the philosopher king in Plato's Republic. Please join me in welcoming Professor Berger to the Montesquieu Forum.
Thank you for the kind words, Stuart. Maybe deep conversations because of deep confusions, probably. It's a pleasure to be here and see a lot of good friends again. I'm doing something very brave today. I was thinking about the beginning. You probably all remember the beginning of the Apology, where Socrates says, "Oh, I'm just coming up here and speaking spontaneously," which of course is very funny since Plato has crafted every word in perfect order. But I'm saying that to you quite honestly. And I know a lot of you have been working hard with Professor Warner on the Republic all semester, so I hope I'm not a corrupting influence by showing how much I'm still struggling with after many, many years of thinking about it. So today I really think I'm thinking about and want to talk to everyone about and hope that I'll get some feedback from you. What I guess is the primary or a primary question about the Republic, and that is this whole crazy schema that these guys are dreaming up possible or impossible? And all of the scholars and thinkers that I respect and look up to, I can't pin down what they think. I don't know anymore what I think, and I don't know what any of them think. So I think it's got to be, if it were just me, I would take responsibility for not understanding it well enough, but it must be a really tough question if some of the people I have in mind haven't figured that out yet. And I think most of us I should start by saying what you all know. The Republic, I would think, we could say, is the most influential philosophic work ever. I'd be bold enough to suggest, and perhaps the most controversial, and is blamed for a lot of terrible things, despotic regimes. It's a really very important and crucial book, and how you read it, and I don't think there could ever be as much enmity about any other interpretation of a philosophic work. People who think this is an ideal or a kind of blueprint for politics, and people who think it's a drastic warning against the sort of political idealism that's represented, are at each other's throats for good reasons. So it's tough, and I think most of us, at least I'll speak for myself, are inclined to, as soon as you hear the interpretation, and if you at least have an inkling that Plato is a very ironic and funny and careful writer, I think we all have an inclination to go with the interpretation that this portrait of the best city in speech, well, first of all, it is in speech. That already saves it a little bit, right? In speech as opposed to in deed. But we have an inkling to think that this is meant to be a warning. It's meant to describe an impossibility. And then we want to figure out what we're supposed to learn. Why did Plato have to lead us to, what problem are we being led to think about through this portrayal of an impossible model of society and of the philosopher in relation to society? And of course that's the answer. I have one answer to all of my questions. I have one answer today. Of course that is what we're supposed to think about, the relation of the philosopher to society. Whatever is going on, whatever the intention, that's the problem that obviously is the real issue here. So I was saying, I think that we don't, most of you agree with me, we have an inkling to assume that it's really not a possibility, because it goes so against the grain, I think, of what we perhaps take too much for granted as a reasonable political model, something close to liberal democracy, or something that allows for freedom of thought and freedom of the individual and autonomy and all of the things that the Republic city seems to deny. So most of my years of thinking about the Republic, that's the direction I've gone in. But I think that I've been pulled, to some extent, I've been pulled in the other direction to take a little bit more seriously that maybe this is not something we like, the thought of a city ruled by a wise man, if there were such a being. Maybe we don't like it, but maybe that is Plato's serious intent to at least propose it and consider it and take it seriously. And I think the tradition that has led me in that direction, or at least raised the question for me, and in fact, when I said to Stuart I would come to do this, my original intention was, I'm very interested in the Arabic tradition, in Al-Farabi and Maimonides in particular, who took the notion of the philosopher king from Plato and translated it into the prophet legislator of Islam, or of, in Maimonides' case, of Moses. So actually I didn't think about it, but my first paper was a prelude to this, or I'm going backwards from the first paper. So it seems that perhaps there was, I mean, the reason I'm not going to speak about that today is I haven't figured that issue out either, but that tradition looks like it's proposing a serious application of this idea, the prophet legislator. And I now see, this much I hope I can convey a little bit glimpse of today through Republic 6, in particular, Book 6 of the Republic. But that tradition does seem to take seriously the idea that the best society, which would foster human happiness and allow the flourishing of individuals to the furthest capacity of which they are capable, would be one either founded, or I should say founded by this prophet legislator, who is an incarnation of Plato's philosopher king. So coming at it from that angle has led me to rethink whether there might not be something serious here, as foreign or remote as it seems. So, this is a huge question. In a way, it reverberates through almost the whole book of the Republic. But obviously, in a way, the core of the whole thing is the philosopher king. The core of the question whether the city of the Republic is possible turns on this idea of being ruled by a philosopher. So I wanted to concentrate on that and get into it through the end of Book 5 and Book 6, which is where it's discussed. But you need an angle for that. Book 6, I don't know if those of you who studied the Republic would agree with me, but it has a feel of being much less tightly structured than most of the other books of the Republic. It's very hard to get a handle on the order and organization. So you need some kind of angle. And it dawned on me this last time through, I started paying attention to this theme that you have in the title of my talk, of laughter and anger. And I believe it turns out, I don't think it takes me quite as far as I'd like, it doesn't give me an answer to my question, but it turns out, I think, to be an extremely illuminating thread to follow, perhaps through the whole Republic, but in particular through books 5 and 6. Just this simple literary or dramatic element or theme of laughing turning into anger. So what alerts one to that, to the importance of that theme, you have, I hope I can make some use of this hand up, but I'm really hoping that you guys will go home and restudy books 5 and 6 and tell me what all of these passages mean. But I start with Euthyphro because I think that's what motivates this way of looking at things. Mr. Kerber, let me see this anymore. Okay, so, as you know, Euthyphro is this very peculiar fellow and a prophet. Plato's only representation of the prophet. But it's an extremely comic representation. In any case, he meets up with Socrates right before Socrates is receiving his indictment for impiety and corrupting the youth. And Euthyphro tells him, oh yeah, here's the line, right? I know why they're putting you on trial, Socrates, because you have this inner voice, this daimonion that you say comes to you. And that's why Miletus has brought the indictment. And he says you're making innovations concerning the divine things. And that's what they say about me when I go into the assembly and I'm a prophet and I tell them the divine things. They laugh at me as if I were mad. And Socrates says, very casually, oh, Euthyphro, being laughed at is not to worry about. I wish they would laugh at me. But in fact, their spiritedness is aroused at me, or anyone who they think makes others like himself. So if they were going to laugh at me, as you say they do at you, that would, as Socrates puts it, it would not be unpleasant to pass the time in the law court joking and laughing. But if they're going to be serious, then how this will turn out is unclear, except to you diviners. And of course, Plato's joke in the end is that Euthyphro gets it all wrong. He thinks it's going to go fine. Okay, casual exchange, right? I think this goes very, very deep. And it's very worth pondering and not easy to figure out really what it's about. What do we laugh at? What really is the motive? And obviously there's a plurality of motives, but what do we laugh at or ridicule? And how can that same thing turn into a target of anger, so lethal that you want to kill the person? Almost the same thing. And so Plato is, portraying that, I think, in the Euthyphro, you're seeing the two sides. Euthyphro is a kind of comic caricature in some ways of Socratic philosopher. But one is so laughable or ridiculous, and one the city is going to convict and execute. So that's really the puzzle. And it runs through all of Plato. Ultimately, it comes to the question, maybe we can come back to this later in a discussion, also about what Plato's doing with his works. Because this, of course you all know this, right? When Socrates says, that, I wish they would laugh at me, but we can't play around in the courtroom, he's alluding, I remind you, to Aristophanes' clouds, which he puts so much emphasis on in his trial, right? Years ago, the deep roots of the prejudice against me, he says, was the portrayal of Aristophanes. That's the root of the charges against me for impiety and corrupting the youth. So a comedy in this pivotal event in the Platonic universe, the trial and death of Socrates, begins with a comedy and ends with the trial and execution. So, and it wouldn't be surprising in the Republic, again, I'm probably reminding you of what you know, but the content of the best city and speech in the Republic is rich, unbelievably rich, I read it again, with allusions to Aristophanes' Ecclesia Zeusae, or the assembly women. I don't think I remembered how completely resonant, Praxagra, the philosopher queen, comes up with an idea for a new society. There's so much injustice in the world, there's rich and there's poor. We'll get rid of that, we'll just have communism. What will we do with husbands and wives? She figures out the whole scheme of the Republic. So it's laughable, it's hilarious. And Plato, with his genius, has somehow taken that. And I'm not sure how we do want to designate it. He's taken that and turned it into Book 5 of the Republic. It's a comedy, and, you know, as Leo Strauss makes this remark very eloquently, the Platonic dialogues are somehow, and philosophy as such, is closer to comedy than to tragedy. But it's, in a way, it is beyond comedy and tragedy. It's not partial the way comedy and tragedy is. So what's kind of impressive, is one of the impressive things to me, is the way Plato has taken this hilarious, imaginary, I think in Aristophanes' eyes, clearly impossible political proposal, and turned it into something of the deepest and utmost seriousness, but still very funny. So that's the thing. And again, another kind of piece of this puzzle to sort of jump to the end in a way that confirms that this seems to be on the right track is near the end of my handout there from the story of the cave, the allegory of the cave, my second to the last passage I got for you. No, I'm sorry. Where is it? No, it's Book 7, 516e, 517a. In a way, I'm starting with this because I think it's just crystal clear, and everything gets murky after this. Socrates has told the whole tale of the release of someone from the cave, gets out into the sun, and is now going to be compelled to come back down and descend into the cave. So you have the two turnarounds. He had to turn around once to get out of the cave, has to turn around again and come back to the cave. And then Socrates makes this remark that could pass by very quickly if you're not attending to this theme. He describes how this person would come back down and his eyes would be just still filled with darkness. And if he had to compete with the others, judging the shadows while his vision was dim, wouldn't he be the source of laughter? Wouldn't it be said of him that he went up and came back with his eyes corrupted? It's not even worth trying to go up. And then somehow in the very same sentence it slides immediately. And if they were somehow able to get their hands on and kill the man who attempts to release and lead up, wouldn't they kill him? So, you know, in the course of one sentence, it moves from this object of ridicule and laughter to wanting to kill him. And that's the end of that's kind of the end of the cave analogy there. So that strikes me as important, that Plato should end the whole account of the cave with that double response. And in a way, it gives away, there are some answers. I've got a lot of things unanswered, but it gives away a lot, doesn't it, if you just read that sentence, that I don't know if I could spell out, I don't think, it's probably clear to everyone why you would laugh at him. There's something ridiculous, right, about this wise man who comes back and can't know what everybody else in the city knows. Can't compete with everybody else in the city, and he's supposed to be the wise man. That's ridiculous. The point at which it becomes murderous anger is if he tries to turn someone else around. So I think that passage does make crystal clear what the turning point is, what the difference is. So let me go backwards now. Let's go back. Another piece of this that got me to start thinking about it is, again, everybody knows this, I think you all know this, the proposal for the city that Socrates lays out and organizes in Book 5 comes under this image of three waves, that there are three waves he's going to deal with. And I think we all assume, I know I did, three waves of laughter. So once I started trying to follow this thread, it struck me as very interesting that he actually doesn't, when the first one that he introduces at 452a, so it should be simple, right? Equality, communism, philosopher, king. They're not on a par. There's a lot of interesting issues about relations among them, but there are these three things that are supposed to be three waves. Three waves of laughter. But actually that's extremely imprecise. He never, I can't find, I might be wrong, and going to go look more carefully, and I'd love to have anybody tell me, call my attention to this. But I believe that he never says about communism anything to do with laughter. It's not an object of ridicule. There's nothing funny about it, I guess. I don't believe he ever mentions laughter. And the first one is by far the weirdest and the hardest to understand. Let me start like this. You really don't understand that it's three waves of laughter until the third one, the Philosopher King. That's the point where he says, 473C, here I am coming to what we liken to the biggest wave. It's going to drown me in laughter. That's the first time you hear that these were three waves of laughter. Now, retrospectively, it looks that you're supposed to understand the three that way. So then you start to think, what really is funny here? Apparently communism isn't a wave of laughter. There's nothing funny about it, at least as Socrates presents it here. Equality of women, which was supposed to be the point of the first wave, and equal education, if we're going to have women guardians, and based on a long discussion of nature, which I better not digress into, we're going to have to give them the same education as the men, music, gymnastics, and warfare. No laughter about that. That's not particularly funny, I guess. So it's only the Philosopher King. And is that so funny? Why is that so funny? I wonder, I'm pretty sure this is right, but I don't have the full account yet. The way laughter first comes into the whole discussion, as I say, is very strange. He's supposed to be talking about equal education. It really should be the most straightforward point in the whole Republic. It's what a lot of the literature likes about the Republic, right? Plato was the first thinker to say women should have equal education with men. It sounds perfectly plausible. But almost immediately, he gets off on this strange issue that instead of talking about how they're going to have music and gymnastics, well, it is about gymnastics, music education in common, he immediately gets off onto this thing is, what's the funniest thing about this proposal? That the women will have to exercise naked with men. Where is that coming from? And won't that be funny, especially old, wrinkled women exercising? This is a very touchy topic. And it's so complicated. I plant it. I mean, you'll think about it later. I plant the problem. What is the humor here? What is so funny? Here on the surface, right, I suppose the surface argument is supposed to go like this. And then Socrates reminds his interlocutors that, and this is a deep theme, by the way, it does go back to Herodotus, Thucydides. It's a deep theme that Thucydides says the Greeks were the first to have men exercise naked. And I suppose you do all know that gymnastike means naked, being naked exercise, gymnos. So this is a practice, it is a custom for Greek men to exercise naked. So on the surface, the argument goes like this. When that happened, when the Greeks broke away from the barbarians and started that new custom, people must have thought it was hilarious and laughed at it. But now we know that it's the best thing to do. Weird, right? It's not at all, you don't get told why. And so you guys are laughing at this, you think this is so funny, but eventually you will see that when the rationality of this comes out, you will no longer laugh. So the surface argument is we laugh at something that's, well, this is really Aristotle's definition of comedy from the Poetics, something that's ugly or shameful but harmless. That's what we laugh at. Something shameful but harmless. So the surface argument seems to be, you people are so conventional. You say, people are so conventional. They'll laugh at this proposal. But we're trying to break through convention or nomos and impose on a city what is true by nature. And then you won't laugh anymore. That seems to be it. But of course, just to mention two wrinkles, and then we can go on from there. It's not natural for human beings in society to go around without clothes. let's assume, which I think I'll just say dogmatically now, clothing means law or convention, covering up nature. But it's part of human nature to be clothed. So what is the nature we would be getting? In other words, the way Socrates puts it at the end of this discussion, he goes, so well, they'll discover that it's best to strip away everything that veils the ultimate truth, to strip it away. And inquiry has to be ruthless in unveiling to get to what's by nature. So to make this long story short, let's just say for the moment, to me that sounds like what's happening is this might be a principle for philosophy or theorizing or inquiry. Philosophy has to strip away the veils and try to look underneath and be shameless. And what Plato would then be showing is the disastrous mistake, perhaps, of trying to impose that standard for philosophic inquiry to translate it into a political policy or policy for society. So this first wave would really be indicating thereby the tension between philosophy and society. There's another layer to this which I don't know quite how to feed it into this, but isn't the truth of the matter that he's getting at the same time? Why the emphasis I thought about old women? Seems like maybe he's getting at something else here that actually, if the human body, if it's the young body is beautiful by nature, and there's an erotic response to the young and beautiful body by nature. So what we're saying is by nature here, really, we're trying to suppress what's by nature by saying that the old women exercising with the old men will be beautiful. So let's leave it at this for a moment. A very complicated argument is contained here about the relation between nature and convention and how hard it is to get at what's by nature and how complicated nature is. And finally, just to emphasize one point that does seem clear to me, society can't be organized on the principles of stripping away convention to get to nature the way philosophic inquiry might try to do. So this first wave is preparing, I think, for the philosopher king. So let's look at that then. Socrates says, he introduces this third wave at 473C. And I think the main reason I'm inclined to believe that the Republic is a teaching about the impossibility of the city is this is probably the most apocalyptic or messianic claim in all of Plato and Aristotle. I don't really know of anything like this in Greek thought. Anything as apocalyptic or messianic. There's another word I'm looking for, I can't think of the right word. But here's what Socrates says. Unless the philosophers rule as kings, or those now called kings and chiefs genuinely and adequately philosophize, there is no rest from ills for the cities, nor, I think, for humankind. No, that's not the way Plato usually thinks. Plato is not in the business of saving humanity. I don't know if there's anything else like this anywhere in Plato or Aristotle. It's too grand, it's too universal. The cessation of all evils for all of humanity. That's a very, as I'm saying, a messianic almost vision. So, I don't know if you have the same intuition about it that I have, but that's my starting point, that somehow this is very idea of the cessation of all evils, that human life could be remade and society could be reformed in such a, not reformed, revolutionized in such a way that we could abolish evils. Can't be a serious ambition, I believe, for Socratic Platonic philosophy. Yeah, so that's kind of in a way, that's, to me, that's the most important point, but isn't it strange? Why will that drown them in laughter? funny? And if it is, what's funny about it? Is it such an object of ridicule, this messianic ideal that he's picturing here? And then even more striking is immediately, there's no pause, immediately Glaucon pipes up and says, well, Socrates, and he's joking, of course, but still, what he says is, now that you say that, many men, stripped for action, they're naked now to fight him, taking hold of whatever weapon, will run full speed at you to do wonderful deeds. If you don't defend yourself with speech and get away, you'll really pay the penalty in scorn. What? Oh wait, where are we now? It started that this apocalyptic vision is an object of ridicule. I'm still not sure I want to hear what you people think, why it's so funny. And then in the middle of it turns into something else. No, it's not going to cause ridicule. It's going to cause such anger or indignation that people are going to attack, the men are going to attack Socrates. These naked men with weapons are going to attack Socrates. But then, and of course he has to defend himself, and then as you maybe remember, Glaucon goes on to offer his alliance. He will stand firm with Socrates to fight these attackers. And then he goes, you'll pay the penalty in scorn. So the attack is playful, I guess, and it turns back into laughter. So, okay, that's the starting point. Let me try to hit a few highlights, and maybe we can come back and fill in the gaps a little later. The starting point, which I think is a very strange discussion, and maybe this angle that we're taking now does shed some light on it. Book 5 of the Republic ends with a very stark account of the division between opinion and knowledge. And a lot of philosophers, I think philosophic commentators who take it out of context can't make much sense of it. It does not seem like a very plausible account of opinion and knowledge. But the basic idea of it, which cannot be right, not for Socrates or Plato, the basic idea of it is that opinion and knowledge are such independent faculties, and the objects of each are totally different beings or objects. So, I mean, the crucial, simple point to say is you could never move, according to this account, from opinion to knowledge. You couldn't have Socratic philosophy. That's how I want to put this. This account makes Socratic philosophy impossible. Socratic philosophy begins with opinions and tries to examine them to see where they're partial, where they contradict, where they fall apart, to move toward knowledge. This account makes that impossible. But clearly in the context, the purpose of the account is, or the result of the account is, that some human beings are opinion lovers and some few are wisdom, lovers of wisdom or philosophers. Never the twain shall meet. They are two classes of human beings. And Socrates' question after this whole apparent epistemology that everybody argues about the details of, but the only question Socrates asks, the main question he asks is, when we tell these people that they are opinion lovers, this is, I think I have this passage, when we tell them that they're lovers of opinion and not lovers of wisdom, will they be very angry with us if we speak this way? So this whole issue, you know, when you're reading this book by the Republic, you're immersed in trying to analyze this account, what's going on with opinion, and how he analyzes it. But I think the real gist of it is the anger of the people who are being designated as mere opinion lovers. And you then realize I suppose that is the first key or the first clue to the hatred or anger of the philosopher. And the philosopher of this Republic story is in a bind then. If there is going to be any justification of the claim that the wise should rule, it's a title to rule, right? That the wise, if anyone's going to rule the city, it should be the wise. They're the ones who know the good for everyone. And wouldn't we want that if there were someone wise to tell us all the right things to do? That's the title to rule. If there is going to be such a defense of this title to rule, there have to be wise. There have to be those who have this knowledge. And it must be some kind of knowledge of a very different realm than everyone else claims to have. Or why would we hand over the keys to the kingdom to them? So in a way, the philosopher, the potential philosopher king of the Republic needs this crazy analysis. But, as I think Socrates makes clear right away, how could that not arouse anger? If everyone else is told you're a mere opinion lover, and the philosopher has some kind of access to another realm beyond you of knowledge. And Socrates said, and now I forget if he's talking to Glaucon here, I think still. I think it's
Yes.
Glaucon. Am I right? Yeah. Glaucon says, Socrates says, will they be angry? And he goes, no, not if they're persuaded by me, for it's not lawful to be harsh with what's true. And so that keeps running through this whole books 5 and 6. Obviously, a little bit too easy solution to this problem. Okay, so what happens is Socrates says, well, look, the only problem is really that you don't know who the philosophers are. If I could tell you who the true philosophers are, that would do away with all the anger against philosophy. And I want to confess again, this is so difficult. What book 6 is doing, I really don't know. They're the true philosophers, and I learned this, I would say I learned this most from Al-Farabi, who ends his work, The Attainment of Happiness, with an account of the true philosophers, the false philosophers, the vain philosophers, and the counterfeit philosophers. And they're all coming from these passages in book 6. But who are all these characters and what is this all about? It's not at all easy. So Socrates says, I'm going to just explain to you who the true philosophers are. Again, to make another very long story short, he then gives a portrait of the philosopher, which is the most perfect human being you can ever imagine. This philosopher, everything that all moral human beings would want to claim, all of the virtues, all of the characteristics of moral virtue, moderation and courage, greatness of soul is in there, some other magnificence, liberality. I noticed when working on Aristotle's ethics that all of the virtues of Aristotle's ethics show up as their true form in this philosophic character, in this philosophic nature, plus, of course, all the intellectual virtues. Okay, so you have an absolutely perfect human being, all around, practical experience, knowledge, all of moral virtue. And that's Socrates' argument. How could they be angry about this turning over the rule of the city to such an individual? It's not just that he has knowledge, he has the whole package. And Adeimantus then interrupts in the beginning of book 6 and rightly says, Socrates, the problem with you is people do not know how to contradict you. They really don't know how to make an argument once you get started. But this sounds crazy. If these guys are so perfect, how come, I'm at the bottom of my first page now, how come everyone who starts out in philosophy of all of those, most of them become weird and not wicked, and then the few who seem perfectly decent are just useless? So that's the issue that Socrates, that's kind of the issue for the rest of book 6. Socrates has to face that objection. The useless part is much more clear to me than the wicked part. He does start with the useless part. And I'll remind you quickly, it's very famous. I'm sure you remember it. It's very beautifully worked out. Socrates says, in my last passage here on this first page, these decent men who become useless in the cities, their situation is so difficult. There's nothing quite like it. I have to make up an image and put a lot of things together. So think of it this way. There's a ship, and there's a ship owner who's blind and deaf and a little decrepit. And then there are all these aggressive, ambitious, wrangling sailors who are trying to get hold of the rudder. And then there's the true pilot, who is off in his studies studying the heavenly bodies and astronomy and meteorology and so on. So I think it more or less speaks for itself, right? The ship is the city, presumably, and the, maybe this isn't so clear, the ship owner is the people. The sort of deaf and blind demos, the people. And they are being led around by the nose by these wrangling sailors. And presumably the true pilot is simply the philosopher. And they won't acknowledge his right to rule based on wisdom. So that's fine, right? And it makes a lot of sense, and it's a beautiful image for the uselessness of the philosopher. The problem is, or I think the point of it is, when you think about it, he can't rule. That can't be a candidate for rule. If that's who the philosopher were, then it almost speaks for itself. He has no title to rule. His knowledge of meteorology and the stars. I mean, in other words, the reason Plato uses the ship image, and the reason ship of state is such a powerful image, to our, through probably every culture, is because it really is almost not an image. It's a reality, right? The pilot has to rule the ship. I learned this, has anybody ever read the Diaries of Christopher Columbus, the so-called journalism? It's fabulous because on the one hand he's doing all this meteorology and writing these, supposedly these analyses, but he's also so aware of the difficulty of controlling the crew. So he doesn't tell them that he realizes he has no idea where they are. He doesn't tell the crew, and he knows they've abandoned him. So he's got it. Somehow he had both. That's the kind of, if there's a philosopher king, that's what it would require. So, again, to speak kind of dogmatically for a moment, it seems clear to me, this first step is relatively clear to me, that this true pilot is the pre-Socratic philosopher. This true pilot, and maybe what throws you off is Socrates ends by saying, they're not paying attention to him, they're not using his knowledge, and wouldn't this true pilot be called a stargazer and an idle chatterer? And he's very funny, right? It's a humorous figure, a comic figure, the stargazer and the idle chatterer. And those are the labels attached to Socrates in the Apology. So, it all kind of clicks. But then you have to remind yourself, when those labels are attached to Socrates in the Apology, he is being misunderstood or mistaken for a pre-Socratic philosopher. I believe. Okay, so this first step is a beautiful answer, I think, to the uselessness of the philosopher. And it does show you what the fate of the pre-Socratic philosopher would be, and why the pre-Socratic philosopher is really the butt of all of the comedy. Because the Socrates of Aristophanes' Clouds, well, I'm oversimplifying, is at least partly a pre-Socratic philosopher. And you know the joke about Thales, right? He was standing and looking, his mind was in the heavens, and he fell into the well at his feet, and discovered that reality is all water. So, I think what Plato is showing you is, in a way, it's a clue to half of my question. What the philosopher is comic. The philosopher is a figure of ridicule, but maybe really only the pre-Socratic philosopher. And I want to add, I can clarify this later if we want, I want to add that every philosopher is partly a pre-Socratic philosopher. Pre-Socratic philosopher is an element in all philosophy. So yeah, that's clear. Okay, now let's take one more step. Now I think it gets much murkier. Socrates has supposedly responded, I think quite adequately, to the question of the uselessness of the philosophers in the city, and tied the uselessness to the laughing, ridiculing. But now comes the other question, which I find very daunting. What then is responsible for the corruption? And by the way, another deep problem running through this book 6 is, it's not clear, or it's both of these things. On the one hand, the worry is about how the philosopher gets corrupted and ruined in the cities nowadays, or in real cities. But at the same time, the question is how the cities get destroyed by the presence of the philosopher. So Socrates is working through both of these issues. Let me add, one other sort of angle into this that got me to think about this. Again, I think I learned a lot, if only I could master this, from Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi's philosophy of Plato ends in an extremely interesting, provocative way, and that is, he gives an account of what happens when, he's given the whole account of Plato, all of the Socratic dialogues, Plato, nothing about Socrates. Then he comes to the question at the end, what should the philosopher do when he's living in a society that is so base and corrupt, and he can't ever be powerful enough to really change it? And if he lives in it and accommodates to it, he's going to become, I hate to say it, but a fish. Al-Farabi says, there's no difference between a man who becomes a beast because he acts so bestial and a beast that has the shape of a beast with the mind of a man. So the philosopher will become like a fish if you live. Okay. The beast, the idea is that if you live in a society where you can't be fully human, you can't be a philosopher, you can't be the human being at its peak, and if the society is corrupt enough or base enough, you will be living a bestial life, then the philosopher has to decide whether it's better to do that or to be dead. So the whole end of this philosophy of Plato is looking at the trial and death of Socrates and asking, why did Socrates choose to give up his life? So Al-Farabi says, this Plato investigated in a dialogue called the Crito and the Apology, and he goes on a little, and in a dialogue called the Protest of Socrates against the Athenians and the Phaedo. Okay. So that's the question, right? Should you live in a society where you can't really be fully human, or die? And he decided that, and then he goes on, he adds one more step. And he says there are no cities. He realized that there are no regimes and no cities in the world as we know it, where the philosopher can, I don't remember the exact word, which I should remember, but where the philosopher can survive or flourish. And so he realized you have to invent a city of your own, and he did that in the Republic. So I think it's quite, there's so many mysteries and puzzles going on there, but it's very interesting that Al-Farabi ends the philosophy of Plato by tying the Republic so closely to the trial and death of Socrates. And really that's what's behind my reflections here on Book 6 now, because another way we could put this is, the Republic is nutty, right? So these guys staying up all night dreaming about ruling the world. It's a really crackpot picture here. But where it does, and then as Socrates says, and they'll laugh at us or else they'll kill us for this proposal that the philosopher should rule. But actually, Book 6 is the reality principle of the Republic, I think. Book 6 is where the fantasy of the best city in speech, ruled by a philosopher king, links up with reality. Because it really is extended, maybe sometimes extended in ways you can't really figure out, why does it have to keep going on? An extended examination of the actual condition of the philosopher in actual societies. So, there's one argument that I think is, one can see very clearly that he gives there, and it goes something like this. Now we're asking, remember what we're asking, why, not just why the philosophers are useless, but why should the philosophers become corrupt in the actual societies? Whether the ruling of the society would be a solution is another question. Why should they become corrupt? And the basic argument, or the most, I think, powerful argument Socrates gives is, the very nature of the philosopher, which is so great, the strengths, all of the strengths of the philosopher, all those virtues we went through, his intelligence, his virtues, his excellence, not to mention if he has these other things like wealth, family connections, power in the city, handsome, everything that we think is good, all of the positives, all of the goods. turn out to be the grounds of corruption when sown in the wrong soil. And he has that one line that maybe clinches this very neatly. Socrates says something like, if you've got a really big person, a slight person who falls doesn't get hurt that badly. But a big person who falls hurts bad. And that's what he's saying about the philosopher. The philosophic nature, the greatness of the philosophic nature sown in the wrong soil bodes disaster. And there are lines in this discussion that are absolutely clearly referring to Alcibiades, amongst other things going on. Lines, a young man who has all these goods, wealth, power, position, big nature, a big soul, intelligence. If he doesn't, he's vulnerable to corruption on a big scale. So he's explaining Alcibiades. He's explaining us something about this positive and the good, the intrinsic good and bad of this greatness of the philosophic nature. But I think it's very difficult to pin down, what's the blame? What's really being blamed here? Where does the responsibility lie? Where does the blame lie? Supposedly the argument is not on the philosopher. That's supposedly the surface argument. But I wanted to look at maybe, at least let's look at this one more. The real crux of it is at 500. Oh no, let me add one thing first. This is very important. Actually, this is one of the few things that I do see clearly. 499B-C on my second page now. Or maybe I better go to the top and start with it. So the end of the discussion is something like, so there's only a small remnant that are left uncorrupted. A small remnant of philosophers are left uncorrupted. And he tries to give the cases, what those cases are. One of which is his own, his daimonion, this inner voice, which Socrates says kept him from politics, because this daimonion of Socrates is almost like a life instinct. It kept him from politics because it knew that if he tried to do the right thing, he wouldn't survive in the city. So it saved his life in a way. It held him back every time he was about to get politically involved. That's one case, but it's hardly worth mentioning because no one else has that situation. And the weird thing about this, maybe we can come back to this later too, one strange thing about this passage is, actually this assumption seems to be that the ideal is political involvement. The only question, in other words, it sounds as if Socrates is a philosopher only because this daimonion held him back from politics. And all the great natures would be political men if something didn't hold them back, some obstacle. That's kind of strange. But in any case, he ends with this description of the small band of uncorrupted philosophers who've tasted the sweetness of this possession of practicing philosophy privately. And they've seen the madness of the many, and they're like a human being who has fallen in with wild beasts, who would realize he has to keep quiet and mind his own business like a man in a storm standing aside under a little wall. So is that, you don't know, is that Plato's teaching that really is the best the philosopher can do? Adam just says that's not bad. Socrates says, well, it's not great either. And then he gives this response, which I think is very interesting. We won't be able to do it in enough detail, but it's very interesting. He reminds them supposedly what he said at the beginning, right? But look at the difference. That's why I didn't staple this, because I wanted you to compare 499b with where we started, unless philosophers rule as kings or kings rule as philosophers. What he says now is, we said before that neither a city nor a regime would ever become perfect, or a man, until out of chance there's some necessity on the few philosophers who aren't vicious, but are now called useless, to care for the city. Bloom translates it to take charge of the city. And that's possible, that is a meaning of that verb. But I would like to give it the more other extreme translation, because I think it brings something out that you weren't aware of at all. Epimeleithana or something like that. Epimeleithana. To care for the city, it does mean to take charge. So maybe, obviously, Plato found a word that sounds real similar to what he started with. Philosophers will be kings and rule. But it's not the same. So there's chance, there's going to be chance. Chance brings some kind of necessity. And the necessity will impose on the philosophers to care for the city. Or, on the other hand, and this is equally interesting because you think these are just parallel. Either philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers, but it's quite different. Or a true erotic passion, it's just eros, a true eros for true philosophy, out of some divine inspiration, comes to the powerful to philosophize, right? So I think this is interesting for a lot of reasons. One is how different it is on the two sides. For the philosophers, what's going to happen to the philosophers is just some necessity. What necessity? I'm interested if anyone has, I'm not sure. What is he thinking of? What necessity would come to the philosophers? And that necessity is going to emerge just out of chance. It's still just chance, right? It's going to bring about some necessity on the philosophers. Whereas for the powerful to turn to philosophy, that's going to require more than just chance. That's going to require divine inspiration. That's not going to happen unless there's a God, I guess. So they're not really parallel. And then most important of all is, what? The necessity on the philosophers to do what? I think he's completely dropped at this point, the idea of the philosopher king. The necessity is to care for the city, whatever that means exactly. So, you know, what's going on here is, we started by saying everybody argues about whether the Republic City is a possibility or an impossibility. But of course, the subtle thing is, what are we asking to, whether it's possible or impossible? I don't think this is the only thing. There are several permutations of what you're even talking about to be possible or impossible. After this line that I quoted, or before, I forget which one, right around there, Socrates says something like, so if this has ever happened anywhere in the most remote place, barbarian world, or ever in time, in the distant past or future, we will be able to say that this is a possibility. But what's the it there? It looks like it's no longer about philosophers being kings, but philosophers caring for the city, perhaps. So, maybe this is, end with this, let me add one last step here, which I think is, this passage at 500D and so on is quite beautiful, I think. He's describing now how this is going to come about, right? I guess this is his reflection on what this necessity is. So it starts like this, that everybody else is so petty. They care only about the small things. The philosopher whose mind is in the heavens and who's in touch with eternity would never stoop to worry about these mere human things. That's problematic in itself, but really not. So the philosopher, you've perhaps heard, everyone here has heard the formula, imitation of God, right? Here we get what sounds like that, what I always thought was that, but it's not quite that. It's imitation of the divine. But the divine here isn't a God. The divine is the cosmos, the cosmic, the orderly. But so here's the image, right? The philosopher, we were laughing at as a stargazer, is now the philosopher contemplating the divine and orderly structure of the universe. And when he's contemplating, he's imitating or emulating that. He's making himself be what he contemplates, divine and orderly. That sounds good. I'm happy with that, right? That's very nice. And then suddenly he goes, but if some necessity comes up, what necessity? I still want to know. If some necessity comes up for him, to practice putting what he sees there not into his own soul. In other words, the original thing was the philosopher is an individual whose knowledge of the beings molds his own character or soul. But suddenly we have a necessity imposed on him not just to do that, not to make himself into the imitation of the orderly universe, but to put it into the dispositions of human beings. And not just in private, which would be bad enough, but in public and in private. And Socrates says, do you think he'll be a bad craftsman of vulgar virtue, of demonic virtue? I think maybe he would be. I think that would be a good line for Aristotle's Ethics in a nutshell. I think Aristotle thinks he might be a bad craftsman of vulgar virtue. The kind of virtue where you habituate children from the beginning to have moderate habits and judgments and so on. But this is a rhetorical question here, right? Would he be a bad craftsman of demonic virtue? He who has contemplated the orderly and divine nature of the whole? And then Socrates says, if the many become aware that what we were saying about this man is true, they won't be harsh anymore with the philosophers. They won't distrust us when we say that a city could never be happy unless its outlines are drawn by the painters who use the divine pattern. No, they won't be harsh. Adamantha says, but what kind of drawing are you talking about? Well, says Socrates, they would take the city and the human beings like it's a tablet and wipe the slate clean. Nobody will be angry about that. And then they would outline the shape of the regime. And the way they would do it is they look to the just by nature, and that is the line, I believe, where the whole idea of natural right, if natural right is in Plato's thought, it's right there in that line. That's what, I think that's the only, that's what natural right would be, looking to the just by nature. The natural right that Leo Strauss says would be dynamite for a political society is this divine paradigm that the philosopher lives in. So they're looking, on the one hand, they're turning in two directions, these philosophers, right? These divine painters. They're looking at the just and beautiful and moderate. I don't know what moderation is doing. The just, the beautiful, and the moderate by nature. And then they turn to the human being. And now they have to rub out some stuff. All that rough stuff in human habits and customs and character and nature and psychology. They rub it out a little bit and they fill it in light of this divine paradigm. Okay, well, he says to Adamantha, are we persuading those men who you said, it wasn't him, it was Glaucon, I don't know what's going on with that. Are we persuading them when you said those guys were going to come at us full speed and attack us? That the man we were praising to them, he's just a painter of these regimes. It's because of him that they were so harsh, because we were handing the cities over to him. Aren't they gentler now? Oh yes, if they are moderate. So, maybe we should leave it at that. Let me just end by saying, why, my question in my mind is, why, I think you all get this picture he's painted here, right? Of the extremely terrifying, I think, image of this philosopher, craftsman of demonic virtue. So my question is, or I think one of Plato's questions is, why has Socrates gone so out of his way? This is so preposterous, right? How could this make people gentle and moderate? It looks quite the contrary, that he's gone out of his way to have Socrates construct an image that would really make you harsh and angry at the philosopher. This philosopher who's going to paint human nature in the colors that he sees. So why? Why has he gone so out of his way to do that? And the confirmation of this, the end of the story, you could say, is with my second to the last passage. You suddenly find out, after you've gone through the whole cave image and everything else, you find out at the very end that the way this is going to happen, Socrates ends by saying, It's hard, but in a way it's possible, but only in this way. When the true philosophers come into power, they're going to drive everybody out over 10 years old out of the city. So that's the way this painting of the human beings is going to work, is get rid of all mature human beings. Stop there.
Well, fortunately, we don't have to quite yet get rid of all the mature human beings. Professor Berger remains for questions and comments and even answers.
Answers! Right?
I have a question about this messianic character.
Yeah.
But it strikes
There's
me that,
another word I'm thinking of. You know what that is? Apocalyptic, messianic?
Heliastic.
Oh, I wasn't thinking of that one. That's good too.
but,
Millenarian?
Another good one, which I wasn't thinking of.
but specifically with the ship image,
Yeah.
not the philosopher king, which is to say, I know you said it looks like it's impossible because he has to look at the stars and rule the man. But then just looking at the example, isn't it just simply true that a person who had such knowledge about sailing a ship, where to go, could in fact solve our problems if we were sort of led astray or something like this? Which is to say, it's not, I mean, it just hasn't, it doesn't seem messianic to me to say that this guy could actually just know. And it's just true that when you see the ship move, you're like, yeah, he could, if someone had this knowledge, he could solve everything.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm wondering, I mean, isn't it the case that,
And that's the argument that draws you toward wanting to say maybe there is something to this.
well, I mean, well, one, is it true that this knowledge could get the ship out of trouble? But two, isn't there something, as soon as I see this, isn't there something sort of messianic in me that sort of wants to seize on, yes, that's, I mean, what's not to hope for if someone has this kind of knowledge?
Yeah. And, you can see I partly use those terms because it looks like it's pointing toward God or divine providence.
But don't we want such a person to be able to say, oh yeah, land is over there?
Yeah.
It's just simple. So.
Yeah. We do and we don't, right? I mean, there's so many layers of the impossibility side. Right? On the one hand, does the philosopher have this knowledge? Even if you did have it about, I mean, we don't have it, we've got a lot better medical knowledge than they had, right? But we don't have perfect medical knowledge, let alone meteorological knowledge. Like, I can't believe they haven't figured out how to cool the ocean so we don't have hurricanes. Can't always figure that out, like dump ice in the ocean or something. So, I mean, we don't even have that, right? Let alone knowledge of the just, the beautiful, and the good. And not only knowledge of the just, the beautiful, and the good, you have to have that. Socrates is only on the way to it, so who has that, right? He doesn't. You'd have to have that. Knowledge of ignorance, that's the deep question is, would knowledge of ignorance be enough? Let's start by assuming it wouldn't be enough. You'd have to have knowledge of the just, the beautiful, and the good. That's not enough. You have to also know how to paint it in the characters of human beings or induce it in the human characters. And what about the resistance that people have to being told what to do? As, for example, every parent knows, even when you do know what's good, right? So, or teachers sometimes, even when you do know what's good. So that's certainly one, whether the philosopher ever has the knowledge that this whole argument turns on. I kind of deliberately put it before, the title to rule is wisdom. Wisdom is a title to rule, but the philosopher doesn't have wisdom. So you've got that problem.
Why does he seek it? Is it because he hopes that he's going to have something like this kind of knowledge?
But I think what this at least one of the, layers or one of the threads of this argument of the Republic suggests is that either that you seek it to begin with in order to remake the world in light of your understanding, or the only other option is you didn't start out seeking it that way, but if you really did know what was good for people, it's hard not to want to guide them, as also every parent does. So it might not be the real initial motive, but what really complicates this whole thing, I think, is that there is if you put what I'm saying very formally, it does apply to Socrates in his knowledge of ignorance. He's not keeping it to himself. He is trying to affect others through the knowledge of ignorance, which is his wisdom. But it's far from ruling a city, that's for sure, right? And look where it got him. Seems to be Plato's reflection here. We're back to the initial problem. Either he was a butt of humor or perceived as such a threat. Hannes, and then.
Do you imagine everyone is laughing throughout book 5? Because as far as I know, Plato never tells us that they actually laugh. There's this whole business Socrates says all the time, like, this is laughable.
Yeah.
But Plato never tells us that anyone is laughing.
Except for us, not there.
Exactly. No, do I have it with me? I did make a list. Cephalus laughs at Socrates' joke about Polemarchus being his heir. I don't know why.
There are other places.
But specifically in book 5.
There's a part where Glaucon smiles about something. What do you make of that?
Well,
I don't find it funny?
Well, I think the problem is they don't have any distance. At the very end of book 4, we get this business that you can really only laugh about the irrational.
Yeah.
They're too deep in the argument, I would say. That's sort of the problem. I mean, you imagine Socrates really tries to pull them out. Like, he suggests, like, this is totally ridiculous, and the next suggestion is even more ridiculous, and then Philosopher Kings. And he doesn't get them out again.
The next suggestion isn't more ridiculous. Ridicule and laughter don't show up in women and children in common at all. And there's a density of references, 9 for the first wave and only 1 for the third, and none at all for the second. So there's this peculiar pattern.
So maybe our two sort of slightly different points. Like, one is, why does Plato have Socrates say things that are supposed to be funny, and why aren't they funny? But you're right about the action, I think, of the action of the dialogue here. It's interesting that, are they finding this all amusing? I wondered, like, boy, they seem to be pushovers, right? Like when Socrates says, they won't be mad, will they, when we talk? Oh no, they won't be mad, they'll be soothed. It started with the thing about the angry, it started back in book 5 about the angry opinion lovers, who are going to really be angry because they're told they're only lovers of opinion. And they seem to think it's going to be very easy to soothe them and persuade them.
Without showing them they're sick. So it's not really showing them. Right, well, hiding from them that they're sick.
Yeah.
Can you say that?
Yeah.
Just one thing, interesting to the argument you're running at 337a in book 1, the discussion with Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus bursts out laughing scornfully.
It's a different word, Sardonia.
Sardonia?
Yeah. It's not Gilion. But but sure,
But the idea, the concept is there.
Yeah. And that's part of this whole story of how complex laugh, like what do we laugh at? That on the one hand, there's a kind of, as Plato puts, Socrates says in Gorgias, you think you can refute by scorning someone. And Socrates responds to Thrasymachus there that way. You can't just ridicule or scorn someone.
Yeah.
So there's that disdainful thing. But then there's this whole issue about laughing at the shameful.
At the end,
Yeah. And then one other thing about this that's interesting is in Plato's analysis in the Philebus of comedy, which is his reflection on Aristophanes and Socrates, there the account goes that the comic poet, it's a mixture of pleasure and pain in the soul. Because laughing is pleasant. Laughing at someone is pleasant. If you're not one of you. For the laughers, it's pleasant. But that pleasure is really relieving a pain. What pain? Aristophanes' envy of Socrates. It's not totally obvious what he envies, but he envies something about Socrates' wisdom. He's envious of it. And he relieves himself of that pain by the pleasure of laughter. So laughing as a relief of envy is here. I don't know what to make of it all, but I've seen that the language here too, that the many who are angry, the whole issue of envy comes up. And of course, that makes sense, right? That initial starting point. You're told you're just an opinion lover. You're going to be envious of the one who's supposed to have this special knowledge. But, there's more we can say about that. So you're going to figure out for me, why don't they laugh, and what are they? Why do they?
You're asking for the philosophic laughter, not angry laughter, because the primary anger is angry laughter.
Yeah.
I mean, about hell at the end. So you're wondering why they're not laughing in a way that shows their freedom from false opinion or from false expectations, something like that. Liberated, light laughter, not the laughter that seeks a mighty change.
That's very helpful. So part of, I didn't even mention it, which is probably the central issue, but obviously this whole theme of the laughter turning into anger is continuing with the theme of spiritedness or thumos that we have from the beginning of the Republic. The Republic is, if nothing else, the whole dialogue is a reflection on the psychology of thumos, or of spiritedness. So that's a very good point that, I can now see an angle in your point, that the laughter that's going on here that turns into anger is here's one way you could put it. Is there a common root? I'm thinking of them as two opposites. Either you laugh at someone because he's so ridiculous but harmless, or you hate them and are angry because he's dangerous. But maybe there's a common root, a common ground or root to those two that is a thematic or spirited root. And I think that's right. So that would have to then be juxtaposed with the laughter of the philosopher. The thing I started with when I said the Platonic dialogue is closer to comedy, because reality is funny.
Well, let me see. One question of partial knowledge or opinion that goes along, I think, with your thesis and then my actual question. And that is, somewhere I read that the three waves refers to saying that the third wave is what carries you out to sea, so that the three waves of laughter would be connected to also death. I don't know about the saying though. My real question is why you didn't play on what I think is the double play or the dual definition of philosophy in this section. So on the one hand, along the lines of the question that Rafe raised, it seems to me that keeping to the metaphor, it's not a stargazer, it's a navigator. Because we have a ship and a person, and if you had someone who could navigate, you would get to land.
Yeah.
So there's the philosopher who possesses the knowledge, that's one philosopher, and that would be the knowledge, presumably, of the just, etc., that would enable you to paint. But that's played against, at least the way I read it, the nature of the philosopher is described in terms of eros, and so it's described in terms of a desire for truth, not the possession of truth. And that's also closer to Socrates, who says that he's the non-corrupted philosopher. And that gives rise, I think, to a different justification of the philosopher's rule, which is not because the philosopher has wisdom, but in the part you didn't quote in 7, the reason why the philosopher is a desirable ruler is the philosopher can't get what he or she wants out of rule.
Yeah.
So not greedy, not power hungry, not honor hungry. So the philosopher, if forced to rule, will rule for the common benefit. And that's again closer to the care. But my basic question is why not see the two definitions of philosopher that are being played?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. At least two, though.
At least.
I mean, now don't you wish we should sit down again and go line by line? It's so complicated. Book 6, it keeps going on and on with these very subtle, different developments. Some of that discussion of the nature of the philosopher just seems so crazily idealized. I'm not sure what's going on with that, the application of these moral virtues to the philosopher. And some of it is about at first I buy it, right? The idea that the philosopher's mind is on something else. He is, Socrates says, would a man whose mind is on the eternal beings be so petty to fall into these ordinary? But on the other hand, that slides into something that makes you skeptical of what he's saying. He wouldn't talk about human beings and gossip or something. Wait a minute, what's going on? Who's that? That's no longer Socrates. So the usual thing, I think one thing we could say for sure is this. At first, the way he introduces the question, "Who is the philosopher?" seems sort of silly. People are angry. It's not going to help soothe them to prove who the philosopher is. That's not going to solve the problem. But actually, at the same time, that is the central question probably of Book 6. Who or what is the philosopher? In a way, it's a version of the question of the sophist and statesman, right? And the apology, that the philosopher appears in all these guises, and who or what is the true philosopher? And again, back to my Al-Farabi passage, boy, does he pick up on that. He's got so many layers of these different distortions of the philosopher. And I didn't even touch upon, I don't know who half these people are he's talking about. Like, who are the people who, there's this metaphor from the Odyssey, that, remember this philosophy is the unwedded, philosophy has been left forlorn and unwedded, because the true philosophic natures have abandoned her. And now in rush a riotous crew of unfitting, what are those people? And then you have the people imitating the philosopher. There's a lot of obscure references there. Somehow the idea is that the blame of philosophy, the real way to pin the blame of philosophy is the unfit practitioners of it, or introducing philosophy to those who are unfit for it. It's in a way a kind of argument for esotericism, I think, right? That the danger comes with philosophy is dangerous. And I forgot to mention, we're going to maybe talk tomorrow about the dialectics orphan discussion at the end of Book 7. Philosophy is dangerous, it's subversive, it's dynamite, and so you really better have the right nature.
Doesn't it work the other way around? I mean, it's not that they're introducing philosophy, it's that in the absence of real philosophers, non-philosophers step in and pretend to be philosophers.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't remember all of
know.
careful and colorful characterizations,
right.
But they would at least be partly the vein of...
Yes, but who are they? I don't know who he's...
Sophists.
You think it's a sophist, but I'm not sure it is a sophist, because the sophists then get a different treatment. It might still be there in different guises, but the sophists get a really positive, rap here. And the real sophist is the city, because the city is the cave. The city molds everyone, and there's almost no way to escape it. And then he ends it by saying, and even if you could somehow get away with it, the city has so much power, it has punishment, and, right? So, and then he says, in light of that great sophist, those people that you guys call the sophists, the private wage earners, they have no real power to corrupt. So they kind of get off easy, the official sophists. Or I think this happens a lot in Plato. Socrates shows his alliance or his allegiance with the sophist over against the big sophist of the city. So let's say, Catherine, what's the answer to your question? There are a lot of different, there's a very messy portrait of the philosopher here. It's partly the pre-Socratic philosopher, it's partly Socrates, it's partly an image of the one who has knowledge. And you're right, part of it is I'm not, the eros question is very interesting. Isn't it striking that where it really comes out most manifestly is an eros that's going to come to the powerful to philosophize? Whereas the philosophers are operating in the opposite direction under some necessity. So, what?
Except the natural ones.
Uh-huh.
At the beginning, so.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we could leave it at this way of putting it. Would it, to go back to your, this kind of most concrete suggestion in the Republic is, actually not wanting to rule is a very good motive to put someone in rule. Like, that's when departmentship. You do it. Although then the power takes over. Wouldn't it, is the Republic's teaching that it would denature the philosopher? Does the philosopher, what philosophers have ever ruled, right? And is the philosopher's desire to do justice strong enough to outweigh all the reasons he doesn't want to be bothered? And wouldn't it denature the philosopher, even that to that extent, if he responded to the necessity to rule? So I guess I would end this by saying, I think that I'd like to hold on to that care for the city, because perhaps there's an understanding of the philosopher being compelled, it's still presented as compulsion, to turn his attention away from the beings in the whole, to care for the city. Doesn't necessarily mean to rule the city. What does it mean? That's left open. Michael and Master.
Well, so I had a question more about Ronna than about Plato. Which is, it seems to me you started your talk one way and ended it very much in a different way.
I told you I didn't know what I was doing.
You started by saying that you were now very tempted to the idea that it might be possible for the Republic because of the example of Farabi and Maimonides and those who took their bearing by the prophetic dimension of philosophy, or the prophet philosopher king. But then you concluded, I thought, midway through your talk and from then on pretty strongly, that it was quite impossible. I mean, I think by the end, that seemed to be your strongest conclusion. And the most decisive consideration about its impossibility had to do with this messianic dimension, which seems fairly close to the prophetic.
Exactly.
theme.
Yeah.
So I had two questions that came out of this set of observations. One, are you really puzzled? I'm puzzled about your puzzlement. You don't sound puzzled. But secondly, what do you make of the medievals and their presentation of this book?
Apparently that's not so straightforward either. One way into this that's really interesting to me and shows you why I have to study Plato's laws again. It started striking me if you just oversimplify vastly, philosopher king equals prophet legislator. The first thing that looks wrong with that is the whole idea of the king is over against the law. The law should be impersonal, all the arguments, right? Impersonal, universal, all in principle, not on the spot, not open to the subjective interpretation. Okay, so king should mean no law. So how did they translate philosopher king into prophet legislator? That's kind of my big question now. So two things I would say. One sort of simple answer, which I don't think either Maimonides or I don't think the Hebrew Bible is satisfied with this answer, and that would be, well, you don't need knowledge anymore. You've got God revealing the right way to the prophet. So that solves that problem. And therefore they could be serious, that tradition could be serious about this role in a way that Platonic philosophy could not. But the more interesting point to me is, this is going back to my Moses paper, the more interesting point is, at least I understand Maimonides' interpretation of Exodus this way, that you cannot have the prophet legislator and the divine law unless God withdraws and then the prophet withdraws. So, the symbol he picks on is Moses' burial place. No one knows. He just sort of sinks into the ground and no one knows. So, you kind of see where I'm going, that if the whole idea of rule by law, if divine law is a kind of rule by law, which is, I know, very problematic, but it's a kind of rule by law, it can't work unless you have the withdrawal of the ruler or the legislator and or God behind the back of the legislator. So that's really interesting. That makes the prophet legislator look almost like the opposite idea of the philosopher king. So I don't know if I'm speaking at all for these guys, Al-Farabi or Maimonides, but I bet I'm kind of on the right track to start thinking about it, that they took the Platonic philosopher king idea, and I'm not kidding, the Al-Farabi thing is amazing to read when you read book 6 really carefully. You see everything is coming from book 6. All of his whole account of the different false philosophers. So they took this philosopher king and they translated it into something, and it might be different in the two cases too. What Al-Farabi was up to is probably even more complicated that I don't know. What happens with Islamic, Sharia. But I do see that much, that the way they could make this a reality has a lot to do with turning the king into the legislator. So, Catherine, maybe there's a way to hook into the laws through that path.
Oh, yeah.
I bet you guys that. Yeah.
We have time for one more quick question
Oh,
and
boy,
response.
okay.
It won't be quick if I mention Farabi, so I won't. A quick question would be concerning 487D and so on. Well, I think you suggested that the philosophers mentioned are the pre-Socratics, and they're interested in the heavens. They aren't interested in the character of the people on the ship, as Christopher Columbus or any effective Catholic philosophy.
Yeah.
But it seems that the response to that is neither anger nor laughter, but something that one would call, say, contempt. Right?
Yeah.
The crew just ignores them.
Yeah.
So that would seem to be a third piece of the puzzle.
I'm almost treating laughter in that case as synonymous with contempt.
Oh, is that a safe assumption?
I mean, maybe not. I'm assuming, but of course I'm assuming that we said there are all different grounds for laughter, but I thought one of them was a kind of contempt or scorn. Don't we
But
talk
contempt
about
also sometimes is mixed with anger or sometimes indifference.
Yes.
I mean, something
Yeah.
that you laugh at, you in a way to think about or take seriously, else you can laugh at it.
So I see this is going back to our the other question, right? That okay, here's one simple, way over too simple answer would be a very, amongst the myriad forms and motives and roots of laughter, I want to distinguish two at least. One I'm calling right now for the first time, spirited laughter. Laughter out of a kind of contempt, which is very vulnerable to turning into anger. I put that way, susceptible to turning into anger. But then there's the laughter, the contemplative laughter, something like that. Laughter with a distance in which you see that from the philosophical, well, I'll leave you with a question, right? Or I'll leave this in the form of a question. If it's true that philosophy is closer to comedy than to tragedy, why is that? What is it about the philosopher's way of understanding life that makes it closer to laughing at things? But sure, I'm completely convinced how true that is of Plato. I mean, I always say, if you don't see it's funny, you're not getting it. So it's kind of interesting to see that the reader of the dialogue is experiencing something there that the interlocutors, if you're right, are not.
Thank you very much.